Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you. Cheers. Today, we want to take a theoretical and then a more practical look at the Bauhaus in light of the new Bauhaus Museum or its opening in Weimar. And before we really dive into some images, I'll show you right at the start what we'll be dealing with. In the meantime, let's approach it a bit more theoretically. And in this photo, where construction is still ongoing, you can see two quite different buildings. One of them was built in a dehumanizing dictatorship, and the other in the best Germany of all time. And you can probably guess what it's about. On one side, we have the new Bauhaus Museum, and on the other, the so-called Gauforum in Weimar. And in the second part, we will compare the two a bit to find out what the psychological and social backgrounds of this new way of building are. But first, we want to take a more theoretical look at what the Bauhaus actually is. And it's relatively easy to recognize a Bauhaus building. This is some kind of elementary geometric basic shape, practically contains no ornamentation. And you can already see that I refer to the Bauhaus as an extremist architectural style, precisely because it completely forgoes ornamentation. And now you might say, well, in their own philosophy of history, the Bauhaus is categorized as a cult-like architectural style, similar to what has existed before with Classicism, the Renaissance, and Romanesque, in contrast to the engineering styles that contain more ornamentation, like Gothic, Baroque, and Historicism. And that's true at first. There's nothing new in the Bauhaus. It's basically a more intense continuation of what cult-like architectural styles represented in the past. But, and this is crucial, is really taken to the extreme. So, Classicism certainly knows ornamentation, and the Renaissance does too. But the Bauhaus wants nothing to do with ornament anymore. And that's an interesting point, this extremism, because where does it come from? Think back to the first video I uploaded here. It was about modern painting. And through a hint from Sedlmayr, we recognized that modern, or in general, classical painting, meaning any painting, consists of two basic elements. First, the figures, and second, the pattern. So if you transfer that to ray tracing, you have a three-dimensional object and a texture. And we found that modern painting, which disregards figuration, is limited to only representing patterns. In architecture, there are two key elements, the basic geometric shape and the ornament and applied texture. In the 20th century, namely, that in architecture, in any architecture, there are two fundamental elements. The elementary geometric basic shape, which is mostly elementary geometric. We'll touch on that later, as there are other possibilities too. And secondly, the ornament, which is like an applied texture. And what does the Bauhaus do? Just like modern painting, which gets rid of a significant aspect of painting, namely the figurative element, the Bauhaus also sheds ornamentation, which is to say, the texture, the pattern. That's already an interesting analogy. So it's primarily a one-sidedness, and you can translate that as extremism. On the other hand, in painting, you don't just have the limitation to patterns. Figurative aspect is still there. By the way, I've definitely linked the video for you in case you don't know it yet, or it's displayed up here. Not only does modern painting concentrate only on the pattern, the figurative has of course not disappeared, 2001, but it is now only to be found in sculpture. Think of Kuhn's work or something like that. There's no surface texture anymore. Or if you think about modern sculpture at all, it's either completely smoothed out, which means it lacks any surface precision, so no ornament in that sense. Think back to earlier examples, like drapery and such things. Or on the other hand, it's quite obviously roughly worked, so it has a random surface, but that's obviously not ornament. And you can find a similar phenomenon in architecture. Because while the Bauhaus only focuses on the elementary geometric basic shape and disregards ornamentation, there is a second modern architecture, which is this spacey style that produces very special forms of building. So think, for example, of the theatre in Sydney, the opera. These are shells nested inside each other. Shells are an ancient ornament, used in decoration since antiquity at least. Or take the Guggenheim Museum. I'll link it for you below in case you don't have it in mind. It's basically a spiral, a very large spiral, like an evolute. On an Ionic capital, you have the column. And then these evolutes, which are laid on their side and enlarged 100 times. And then you end up with the Guggenheim Museum, which you see on the other side in these extravagant architectural forms. That's just ornament again, a piece of ornament that has been pulled out and inflated into the building structure itself. So here too you have the separation of these two elements of architecture that were once combined, so to speak, the total work of art. Think of painting and sculpture. So, even during the Renaissance, painting boasted that it could imitate sculpture. And when you think about how sculpture refined itself all the way into the 18th and 19th centuries, you also know that it gained painterly qualities. It became fantastically realistic. Even back in the Renaissance, there was a competition over who created the more complete work of art. And here the exact opposite happens. The elements of the artwork are coming apart. And for everyone who has my book, that would be a hygiene spread. You can see from this, as I already told you about painting, that nothing new is happening here. Rather, something is being taken away. Something is being made one-sided. And this comes from the problem that in the case of painting, we had arrived at realism. And in the case of architecture, it was historicism, where already, because people didn't know what new to create anymore, even though Art Nouveau and the Metropolis style emerged from it, they had already gathered everything together. And now, what should come next? You can't move forward, so you have to go back. The same phenomenon as in painting. And now they realize that if they have to go back, it's simply because things aren't moving forward. Practically speaking, to still sell this as an extension, they somehow have to change the fundamentals. So on the current path of 2021, always striving for perfection, always getting more advanced, there's no progress. They need to go in the other direction. So they have to change their ideal, their goal. And now we come to the somewhat idiosyncratic, the adolescent, contradictory spirituality of this 2021 modern thinking, and also of Bauhaus architecture. The pure spirit of contradiction. That means they have to throw overboard all the fundamentals that have applied to architecture. And this also goes for painting, because those have led in one direction, which has reached its end. So they have to completely redefine everything. Take, for example, Le Corbusier's Human Proportions from 2021. If you show this depiction of a human to a doctor, they would ask, oh, interesting, what kind of medical condition is this? That's not what a human looks like. And no one would think to engrave such a completely deformed human body on the gold plate of the Voyager to show aliens what a human looks like. That's not what he looks like. A human still looks the way Da Vinci painted him in his theory of proportions. That means they suddenly have to redefine the fundamentals of architecture, which are naturally tied to human proportions, by saying that humans are different. Now, of course, humans haven't changed. And that's the absurdity that has to come to light, because they have to redefine the goal. You can't stay the same, because that would lead back to the old direction, which has hit a dead end. So that's obviously the ideal dead end, but as I said, if they want to move forward, this path won't get them there. And so they simply have to discard all the fundamentals that have applied to architecture so far. And for example, come up with things that have nothing to do with the facts, like you always hear this, that functionality was discovered for the first time at the Bauhaus. That's obviously nonsense. Architecture has always been highly functional, especially because it's expensive. Anyone who builds a structure, whether it's a castle or a farmhouse, wants it to be functional first. He's not throwing money around for fun. But, and this is the crucial point, through this one-sided focus on functionality, another element that has been just as important for humans for centuries, namely aesthetics, is completely thrown overboard. It's no longer about whether something is beautiful, it's only about whether it's functional. And then it's concluded that it's beautiful, but that's far from being the case. You can create functional things that aren't beautiful at all. And if you look at how tool production, so very everyday things, has looked over the past 1,000 years, you'll always find that there's a functional unit. And in the final step, it's always beautified. It always gets some kind of ornamentation added, whether it's painted, that there are engravings and so on. So this important element of aesthetics is completely excluded as a criterion. And by taking elements from construction and the prerequisites, they naturally arrive at different results, at clarity. So they end up with an unnatural art because they exclude and no longer consider the natural needs of humans. That's the only way they can arrive at something different. And they need something different to avoid always doing the same thing, which has been realism since the 19th century, and the highest expression of historicism in architecture. So you see, there's fundamentally a deficit in modernity, both in painting and in architecture. And that's this pubescent spirit of contradiction that arises, along with this idiosyncrasy, towards everything that was once thought comprehensively, because those are no longer the foundations. They must all have been wrong since they were based on different premises. And that leads, among other things, to this phenomenon of not wanting to integrate. And now we want to take a look at this using these two examples, the new Bauhaus Museum in Weimar and the old Gauforum. What does integration into the environment mean in architecture? Well, you don't want to place something completely absurd into an otherwise relatively harmonious environment. And you can see here, in the first image, that this also doesn't happen with the Gauforum. So, there's nothing special about what you see here. So you have a city view. This is now from the city center. And the Gauforum is about the same height. In the second image, you can see that even a school, which is located between the new museum, the red brick and red sandstone building, looks just like the elements of the Gauforum, namely a flat-hipped roof and 3 tall stories. So this is an elementary school from around 1870. So the basic form of these buildings is actually one that was already built a century earlier. What you have to understand here is that the National Socialists were not known for particularly appreciating old architecture. So not only had they already torn down entire streets in Berlin for the world capital Germania and wanted to tear down even more, but you might also know, I believe this was a saying of Hitler's, that it was a blessing that everything was just being bombed away by the Allies. So at least we wouldn't have to tear it down ourselves. That's exactly the same kind of thinking that the Bauhaus schools had after the war, celebrating that the city centers in Germany are all flat, so that they could now set up the car-friendly city and these hundreds of meters long Bauhaus blocks. And that's basically what happened in the West as well. But what I want to show you is that the National Socialists, who were really not friends of preserving old buildings, keep in mind that in the 1930s, plans were already underway to tear down the city center of Frankfurt, which then actually happened due to the bombing. It's exactly the same intention. And after the war, the architects were happy. No, that they could finally build without any interruptions. And there were still buildings that could have easily been restored. Also in Kassel, the city center was already approved for demolition in the 1930s. But now let's take a look at what elements were tried to be incorporated into the Gauforum to blend it into the surrounding architecture, and how much different that was with the Bauhaus Museum. So let's take a look at that. We've already seen that the height and shape of the building really match the Weimar standard. Where do I have it now? Ah, yes. And you can also see that this new museum, which was probably built in the 1880s or 90s, appears here in this red sandstone and is relatively close to one of the wings of the Gauforum. And indeed, the Gauforum is basically too large for the space that was available there. People are also upset that a really nice park has been completely built over. Now, you have to consider that there were already 3 streets running through this park, which even arched over each other. So, it wasn't exactly that idyllic, but at least there was a nice fountain to see, and so on, anyway. And there are also ugly spots, for example, towards the Nordstadt, where you have these dark corners that just don't fit at all. But there are also very clear elements here that show how an attempt was made to embed the architecture. And we want to take a look at that, because this is the usual way of building when you want to fit a building into a space. The first thing you see here is that, unlike the other wings of the Gauforum, the left wing, so that's the building on the right side of the image, has these round arched arcades on the ground floor. And you can also see that it continues and forms a connection to the new museum. The first thing you see here is that, unlike the other wings of the Gauforum, the left wing, so that's the building on the right side of the image, has these round arched arcades on the ground floor. And you can also see that it continues and forms a connection to the new museum. The connection is likely for architectural reasons, as the museum's round arches continue here. One is a museum, and the other is an administrative building. But I assume it has purely architectural reasons, because you can see that these are simply the round arches of the museum that have been continued here. So he realized that the size of this Gophorum was designed in such a way you would get quite close to this building. And in order to avoid giving the impression that something had been tampered with, they bandaged it up. That's a very classic architectural element for bringing together building structures. And so they continued these round arched arcades right into this side wing. But a second, even more interesting aspect is that on the other side, on the opposite wing of the Gophorum, you find another angled corner which is decorated a bit differently. You can't see it in the photo right now, but especially you see it's not only set back and angled, but it's also not yellow plastered like the other buildings. Instead, it's done with red sand plaster. And what is that? This oddly angled wing. If we compare the two, you can clearly see what it is. That's the reflection of the new museum. So, to show that this very close building, which obviously represents a completely different style, namely historicism, belongs to this complex, they didn't build the new museum again symmetrically on the other side, but rather an abstract reflection of the new museum. So it's a really nice idea, because the whole complex is mirror symmetrical. So here, once again, they let an abstraction of the already existing old building reappear. These are typical and quite nice ideas on how to make a building that has a completely different and more modern style. Everything here is neoclassical, so very restrained ornamentation. Fit into an existing, for example, to embed more heavily ornamented or completely different architectural structures. By the way, the backside facing the city is designed in such a way that it looks like several buildings. You have these wings sticking out on the side, giving the impression of two street lines on the opposite side, where the city actually begins, where the city center starts, rather than just a huge building complex. So now take a moment to look at how the new Bauhaus Museum is designed. From the park, you can see how this new architecture basically spits in the face of the old in every conceivable way. And that's this idiosyncrasy. This new form of building, this new architecture, can't really come to terms with the fact that there are older ones, because, as I explained to you earlier, it leads in a completely different direction. There can also be no connection. On the left, you have the gardener's house, probably from around 1800. And on the right, you can still see parts of the Gophorum. And the impression you get here is that giant Timbuktu has been playing with dice and just left them lying there. So it's not a cube, it's a rectangular block, but there's no reference to any surrounding buildings here. So even that, what is it? The Weimar Hall is a different style. That doesn't fit together either. It's an alien object. And it has to be an alien object because it pursues completely different goals. Pure functionality, not beauty. False human proportions and so on. And to make the eye, psychological and social aspects of this a bit more interesting, let's ask ourselves, based on this image, if it might be the case here. You know this expression. When a really out there building is put up, people say, and UFO has landed here. And now we want to ask ourselves if this new Bauhaus museum and basically every other Bauhaus building complex is actually an UFO that has landed. You might say, strange question. Has an UFO landed there? Well, that's probably not what an UFO would look like. So, this applies more to buildings of the kind that, as I explained to you earlier, greatly enlarge individual elements of ornamentation, representing a freehand form. You would expect something basic from a UFO, but I'm actually going to show you that this is also a UFO, and a very special one, that has landed here, and we can learn a lot from it about what kind of society this architecture actually belongs to. So, is that a spaceship? Well, you all know the Starship Enterprise, Star Trek, Captain Kirk, and so on. The sequel series. In the 80s, it was all peace, joy, and pancakes, the future. In the 80s, the sequel series, The Next Generation, came out, and that was still basically all peace, joy, and pancakes. But in the 90s, other science fiction stories started to emerge, like Babylon 5. And if you remember, there was, I think, a wormhole through which strange beings would occasionally come right in front of the space station in question, and they were very dangerous. So there was always this kind of dark threat in the background. And that was an interesting new element in storytelling. And the creators of Star Trek thought, we need something like that too. We need a dark threat in the background. And so the screenwriters came up with something. And what they came up with were the Borg.
That already sounds very Nordic. And they are also very distant beings. Distant and tending towards communism. Because they are humanoid. Life forms. More or less all humans. But they are, so to speak, infected by circuitry. Meaning it's introduced into their bloodstream. So they also assimilate humanoid life forms that don't belong to them yet. So they spread throughout the body, and then some kind of circuitry grows on these human beings' faces and elsewhere, turning them into half androids. And they are actually called drones in the film and in the series. Drones of a collective. They are controlled by others. They no longer have feelings. So these are beings, in an absolutely dystopian society, the embodiment of evil, who also adapt to their opponents in a very AI-like way, and so on. So, very creepy. And all they need is an occasional recharge of their batteries. So this species was created by the makers of Star Trek. And they can think whatever they want about Hollywood. So, especially modern political correctness. And sometimes it's also absurd in the storytelling and so on. But one thing they can't deny is that the best designers in the world are in Hollywood. I think that's undisputed. And now these screenwriters come to their designers and check this out. These are the Borg. Design a spaceship for them. And now it's really interesting what the designers come back with. Design a spaceship for them. And now it's really interesting what the designers come back with. Not some streamlined, spaced out spaceship, but a cube. A cube. The Borg cube. I'll link it for you below in case you don't know it. So it's just a dark cube that has some strands on the surface. So it's not all nicely decorated, but it's not an ornament. It's purely technical. And yes, that's exactly consistent and well thought out. Each of these drones has, I don't know, some small room, which is of course cubic. And then you put a few thousand of them together, and in the end, you have a huge cube as a spaceship. Why should there be any for insentient beings who also have they don't need a bar or a holodeck or anything. They don't need a bridge either. There is a Borg queen, but she does everything herself. They don't need leisure activities. They don't need social interaction. These are drones of a collective that are remotely controlled. And what is the ideal architecture for them? Because they live there, on that spaceship. A cube. Because this cube is actually highly functional, right? Just like Bauhaus architecture. It's highly functional, but for human feelings, it's a dystopia. Because that's how you confine rabbits, or rather drones that have no feelings and are remotely controlled. And now you might say, well, that's not the most effective. So a cube should actually be a sphere. But that was already taken. If you know Star Wars, then you know Death Star is a sphere. That's the biggest spaceship of the evil empire. And who lives in this Death Star, in this sphere? Those are the stormtroopers. These people, dressed in white plastic, who are never seen, or at least they are humanoids, but you don't really know who's underneath. They can also just be shot down. That raises no moral concerns at all. In the end, the Death Star is also destroyed. Who knows how many thousands or hundreds of thousands of these stormtroopers are up there. These are basically drones too. They're not remotely controlled yet, but that's just the evil empire. And they get a sphere. And indeed, and was the first spherical house built in the early years. That's modern architecture. That obviously didn't catch on because it's structurally unfavorable. By the way, the first designed spherical house that was never completed, I mean a house, is Napoleon's tomb around 1800. That's classicist, the preceding cult style, which wasn't quite extreme enough to be executed. So you see, quite logically, these designers did what any normal person would say about Bauhaus architecture. So feel free to check out what the major German newspapers have written about this new Bauhaus museum online. That's very critical. And the comments on that are of course even more critical. There it is, just big warehouse. If only they had just built some kind of warehouse, that would have been more honest. And that's exactly a warehouse. It has nothing to do with whether it's a museum or a residential building. You would only build this architecture for storage facilities, if at all. And that's also the demeaning way towards humans. That's the inhuman, the contemptuous aspect of this architecture, that you perceive humans basically as just a storage item. So it's enough for you drones of the collective, who aren't individuals anyway and have no sense of beauty, to live in such warehouses, in such blocks. And that's so beautifully depicted through these science fiction dystopias. The most malicious species inhabit structures that influenced architecture, spheres, and cubes. Modern architecture shifted in 2001 from ornamentation to an inhuman, extremist, and brutalist style. The architecture that promoted spheres and cubes in the 20th century, and you can see that this modern architecture is characterized by its detachment from the important point of aesthetics, which is essentially defined by proportions, and those are represented by ornamentation. The year 2001 triggered this departure from ornamentation, leading to an architecture that is inhuman, extremist, and fundamentally brutalist. These are societies that are associated with brutalism. That's the actual psychosocial essence of this architecture, and everyone feels that too. You have to develop an absolute spirit of contradiction, feel any sympathy for it. And that's a contradiction against any human feeling. That should be it for today. Until next time, take care.